Banff Mercat Cross, 16th of November 1700, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. A crowd gathers. Some jeer, some weep. A tall man climbs the scaffold steps, hands bound, a fiddle clutched under his arm. In the toll booth behind him, the clock reads 2:15, but that's a lie. The hands have been moved forward, 15 minutes stolen from a man who has only minutes left. On the road from Turriff, 8 miles away, a rider gallops through the November cold, a royal reprieve folded in his saddlebag. He will not arrive in time. The fiddler raises his instrument. He begins to play. What brought James Macpherson to this moment? And why, 3 centuries later, do we still remember the tune he played at the foot of the gallows? This is Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, a history podcast that investigates the past like a detective story. Today, we're traveling to turn of the 18th century Scotland to examine the life, crimes, and legendary death of James Macpherson, outlaw, fiddler, and symbol of a brutal legal system that made existing the crime. In this episode, we'll ask, was Macpherson truly a Scottish Robin Hood, or was that myth manufactured after his death? What does the historical record, court transcripts, parish registers, parliamentary acts, actually tell us about who he was and why he died? And how did a man hanged for the crime of being born become a folk hero immortalized by Robert Burns? This is the story of a fiddler who defied death and lost. This chapter answers who was James Macpherson and what made him a criminal from birth. We're starting in 1675 in the Scottish Highlands, where a baby is born who will become an outlaw before he can walk. James Macpherson entered the world around 1675 as what the Scots called a dykesider, the illegitimate child of a Highland laird and a woman of lower status. His father was a member of Clan Macpherson from Inverness-shire. His mother was described in historical sources as either Romani or a Scottish traveler, part of itinerant communities that had lived in Scotland for generations. In an era obsessed with legitimacy and bloodlines, Macpherson's mixed parentage marked him from birth. But here's the surprising part. His father acknowledged him. The laird brought young James to Invereshie House near Kincraig and raised him as his own. Historical accounts from the Clan Macpherson tradition describe him growing up in relative privilege, learning the martial arts of a Highland gentleman. He became, by all accounts, an expert swordsman and a gifted fiddler. Then tragedy struck. Macpherson's father died prematurely, killed, according to one tradition recorded in the Clan Macpherson archives, by Caterans' bands of Highland cattle raiders, while attempting to recover stolen livestock. The boy, James, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, lost his protector, and without a father to defend his claim, the young half-gypsy bastard had no place in a Highland laird's household. James returned to live with his mother and her itinerant kin. Now, let's be clear about what this meant in legal terms. In 1609, 66 years before Macpherson's birth, the Parliament of Scotland had passed the act regarding the Egyptians. This law didn't just criminalize certain behaviors. It made being a gypsy or traveler a capital offense, punishable by expulsion or death. The act declared that anyone known, holden, and repute to be Egyptian could be arrested, tried, and executed without proof of any specific crime beyond their identity. Let me repeat that, because it's central to understanding Macpherson's story. Scotland made existing as a gypsy a crime punishable by hanging. Parish records and court documents from the 17th century show that this wasn't theoretical. In January 1624, 8 gypsy men were hanged in Roslin, near Edinburgh, for violating the expulsion order, even though the Privy Council noted they had been living peacefully in the community. Their wives and children were charged with the same offense of being Egyptians. Similar executions were recorded throughout the 1600s. So, when young James rejoined his mother's family, he became, in the eyes of Scots law, a criminal. Not because of anything he did, because of who he was. By the 1690s, Macpherson had formed a band. Historical sources describe them as cattle thieves, as Caterans in the Highland tradition, and as robbers who targeted the wealthy lairds of Moray. He became known for his physical prowess. In beauty, strength, and stature rarely equaled. The massive two-handed sword attributed to him, displayed historically at Duff House in Banff, suggests he was indeed a man of unusual size. But here's the myth that we need to interrogate. Was Macpherson truly a Scottish Robin Hood who robbed the rich and gave to the poor? Later, folklore painted him that way. Robert Burns' 1788 poem, Macpherson's Farewell, romanticized him as a tragic hero. Victorian writers like J.G. Phillips, whose 1894 biography, James Macpherson, the Highland freebooter, portrayed him sympathetically, cemented the legend. But what does the contemporary evidence say? At his 1700 trial, as preserved in the Spalding Club's miscellany, Macpherson was charged with going up and down the country armed and keeping mercats in a hostile manner. Court records describe him and his band arriving at market days in towns like Keith, Forres, and Elgin, marching in with a piper at their head, intimidating locals. Notably, no historical source, not the trial transcript, not contemporary chroniclers, mentions Macpherson killing anyone. The Dictionary of National Biography notes that no charge of bloodshed was preferred against him. One piece of evidence at trial even showed he had visited a market for the purpose of curing a sick man. So, a cattle thief and market intimidator, yes. A murderer, no. A champion of the poor? The record is silent. What's certain is that Macpherson had made powerful enemies, particularly Alexander Duff of Bracco, a wealthy landowner and merchant whose family would become Earls of Fife. Duff wanted Macpherson stopped. By September 1700, Duff had set a trap, and at the St. Rufus Fair in the town of Keith, it would finally close. This chapter answers, how was Macpherson captured and what role did Alexander Duff play? The St. Rufus Fair was a major market event in Keith, drawing traders and livestock dealers from across the region. Macpherson and his men attended, perhaps brazenly, perhaps unaware of what awaited them. Alexander Duff of Bracco had assembled a posse. Historical accounts describe an aggressive confrontation breaking out. In the fight, one of Macpherson's men was killed. Now, here's where the story becomes legend. Multiple sources claim that Macpherson was prevented from drawing his famous sword when a woman threw a heavy blanket or carpet over him from an upper window. Trapped in the cloth, he was disarmed and seized. The detail appears in 19th century collections, but not in the immediate court records. It has the flavor of a folk detail, added to explain how such a formidable swordsman was captured alive. What's documented in contemporary sources is this. Macpherson was taken prisoner at Keith in September 1700 and transported under heavy guard to the toll booth, the jail, in Banff. He'd been captured before. Historical accounts record escapes in Aberdeen and Inverness, aided by family and townspeople. But this time, Duff ensured there would be no escape. Macpherson was held under an exceptionally strong guard in the Banff toll booth, located on Low Street, the building that would later be replaced by the structure still standing today. 3 other men were arrested with him, James Gordon, Peter or Patrick Brown, and Donald Brown. All were charged under the 1609 Act against the Egyptians. On the 7th of November 1700, they were brought to trial before Sheriff Nicholas Dunbar of Banffshire. Nicholas Dunbar, as hereditary sheriff, is alleged in several regional sources to have been friendly with Alexander Duff of Bracco. However, the depth of their relationship is not attested in primary sources. The trial transcript shows Macpherson and Gordon were found guilty of being Egyptians and vagabonds and sentenced to death by hanging. The exact legal language. For as Michael as you James Macpherson, Penal are found guilty by ein verdict of ani assize, to be noun, holden, and repute to be Egyptian and a vagabond. Peter Brown and Donald Brown received temporary reprieves at the trial. 9 days later, on November 16th, James Macpherson and James Gordon were to be hanged at the Mercat Cross in Banff. But another player was entering the story. Or not. This chapter answers, what happened on the day of Macpherson's execution, and how do we separate fact from legend? The sentence specified that Macpherson and Gordon were to be hanged betwixt the hours of 2 and 3 in the afternoon. This was standard practice. Public executions took place during market hours to maximize the crowd and the deterrent effect. According to the legend, and this is where we must be careful, a reprieve was on its way from a higher court. Multiple sources claim that a messenger rode from Turriff, 8 miles south of Banff, carrying a royal pardon. When Alexander Duff spotted the rider approaching, he ordered the town clock to be put forward by 15 minutes so the execution could be carried out legally before the reprieve arrived. Is this true? No contemporary document from 1700, not the trial transcript, not the Berg records, mentions a reprieve or the clock manipulation. The earliest printed version of the story appears in later oral traditions and 19th century histories. Thus, this is more of a local legend rather than a verified fact. The historian Mary Ann Alberger, writing in 1983, cautioned that there is no contemporary evidence for many of the dramatic details surrounding Macpherson's death. The 1705 broadside printing of Macpherson's Lament, the earliest printed version of the ballad, contains nothing about the dramatic gesture with the fiddle and nothing about fiddling. Yet, the legend persists. What is documented is that a tune called Macpherson's Rant or Macpherson's Lament circulated in Scotland by the early 1700s and was attributed to Macpherson himself. Robert Burns encountered a traditional version and reworked it in 1788 for James Johnson's Scots Musical Museum, creating the version we know today. The story goes that Macpherson composed the tune in his cell in the days before his death. When he was led to the gallows at the Mercat Cross, the execution site on Low Street, where the Broken Fiddle Cafe now stands in his memory, he played the lament one final time. Then, according to tradition, he offered his fiddle to anyone in the crowd who would play the tune at his wake. When no one accepted, fearing they'd be marked as his associate and arrested themselves, Macpherson smashed the fiddle over a stone and was hanged. The Clan Macpherson Museum in Newtonmore, which opened in 1952, displays what it identifies as the broken pieces of Macpherson's fiddle preserved as a clan relic. Here's the historical reality. Whether Macpherson played on the scaffold is unverifiable. Whether the fiddle in the museum is genuinely his is unprovable. But what is certain is that James Macpherson became a symbol, a martyr to an unjust law that criminalized identity rather than action. And on November 16, 1700, that law claimed his life. This chapter answers, what was the 1609 Act? Why was it created? And what does Macpherson's story reveal about justice in early modern Scotland? To understand why James Macpherson died, we must understand the 1609 Act regarding the Egyptians. In the 16th century, Scotland, like much of Europe, saw the arrival of Romani people called Egyptians because of a mistaken belief about their origins. Initially welcomed, they quickly became targets of persecution during the Scottish Reformation. In 1541, James V ordered all gypsies expelled under the pain of death. The 1571 Act of Stringency escalated punishments, hanging, branding, drowning, even pinning gypsies to trees by their ears. Then, in 1603, the Scottish Privy Council ordered all gypsies to leave Scotland permanently, never to return on pain of death. This was ratified in 1609 as parliamentary law. The act didn't require proof of theft or violence. Historian Robert Tyson, cited in a 2024 Scottish government report on policies affecting gypsy and travelers, explains, the 1609 Act did not so much create a new offense as make the status of being a known Egyptian sufficient evidence of theft, without requiring proof of a specific criminal act. Think about that. You could be arrested, tried, and executed simply for being identified, by repute, as a gypsy. Government archives document the enforcement, 19 hangings in January 1624 alone. David Hume, the 18th century Scottish jurist, called the statute so dangerous and so unusual a process. Yet, it remained law throughout the 17th century. When James Macpherson stood trial in 1700, Sheriff Nicholas Dunbar applied this law. The trial transcript shows Macpherson was convicted of being Egyptians and vagabonds and oppressors of his free lieges. The charges included thieving and purse-cutting and keeping mercats in your ordinary manner, but the death sentence was justified by the crime of being an Egyptian. This was heritable jurisdiction in action. Nicholas Dunbar, as hereditary sheriff of Banffshire, wielded near absolute judicial power in his domain. He was accountable to no one but the landowner who appointed him, in this case, the Earl of Fiddler, and by extension, Alexander Duff, who had influence in local governance. The system was designed for control, not justice. Sheriffs and their deputies earned their salaries by taking percentages of fines. They had every incentive to convict. And because heritable jurisdictions operated autonomously, appeals to royal courts were limited, men like Dunbar could act with impunity. The heritable jurisdictions were finally abolished in 1747, 47 years after Macpherson's death, by an act of Parliament following the Jacobite Rising. Compensation was paid to dispossessed landowners. No reparations were made to the families of those unjustly executed. The 1609 Act itself may have remained technically on the books into the 20th century, though enforcement had ceased. Its precise repeal date is unclear but requires more research. James Macpherson's legacy lived on in folklore and song. Robert Burns's Macpherson's Farewell became a standard at Burns suppers and in Scottish folk tradition. The poem's final verse captures the injustice. Now farewell light, thou sunshine bright, and all beneath the sky. May coward shame disdain his name, the wretch that dares not die. Burns transformed Macpherson from a cattle thief into a symbol of defiance against tyranny. But here's the myth we must correct. Macpherson was not primarily executed for robbery. Victorian accounts and folk retellings often claim he was hanged for being a bandit, a kind of Scottish Jesse James. That's romanticism. The historical record is clear. He was hanged for being a gypsy. This distinction matters. Romanticizing Macpherson as an outlaw hero obscures the genocidal intent of the law that killed him. Scotland didn't just punish criminals. It tried to erase an entire people. Today, gypsy and travelers in Scotland face ongoing marginalization, lower life expectancy, educational barriers, discrimination in housing and employment as documented in Scottish government reports. The Clan Macpherson Museum, in a 2020 decolonial reinterpretation project, recontextualized Macpherson's fiddle as an artifact of state violence against traveler communities. James Macpherson was not a Robin Hood. He was a man criminalized from birth, executed under a law designed to eliminate people like his mother. His story is not a romantic ballad. It's evidence of legal atrocity. And 325 years later, we still remember his name and the tune he might have played at the foot of the gallows. Let's review what we've learned. James Macpherson, born around 1675, was the illegitimate son of a Highland laird and a Romani or traveler woman. Under Scotland's 1609 Act regarding the Egyptians, his identity made him a criminal. He became leader of a band that raided cattle and intimidated markets, but no contemporary source accuses him of murder. In September 1700, Alexander Duff of Braco captured him at the St. Rufus Fair in Keith. On November 7th, Sheriff Nicholas Dunbar, Duff's ally, tried and convicted Macpherson of being an Egyptian and a vagabond. 9 days later, he was hanged at Banff Mercat Cross. Legend says he played a self-composed lament and smashed his fiddle before mounting the scaffold. Whether that's literally true, we cannot verify, but the tune survived, and Robert Burns immortalized it in 1788. Macpherson's execution was legal under heritable jurisdiction, a system abolished in 1747. His story reveals how Scottish law weaponized identity, making existence itself a capital crime. If you want more deep dive history investigations, subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. Leave a review. It helps other history detectives find us. Check our other work at https://linktr.ee/beatnomadsofficial. Next time, we're examining the story of Hannibal Barca, focusing on his attempt to conquer Rome and his own government abandoning him. We are Beat Nomads. Thanks for listening.